Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us at this latest ConservativeHome live online event. For those of us who haven't met before, my name is Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of ConservativeHome, and our topic this evening is Back to Business, Reopening International Travel, an event hosted in partnership with Airlines UK, and we're extremely fortunate to have a truly illustrious panel joining us this evening from the travel industry, from specialists with an insight into the challenges facing that particular sector with regard to COVID, and of course by Shapps, the Secretary of State for Transport. None of you need me to enumerate in any detail how challenging and hugely disruptive the last year has been to all sorts of aspects of all of our lives. But the international travel sector in particular has been uniquely affected for obvious reasons. It's something that we've seen the Prime Minister today at his Downing Street press conference talking about and discussing the prospects for when and how decisions are going to be made on reopening international travel. It's something that's hotly contested in Parliament, in the press, and indeed in administrations around the world, as we see mixes of good news, bad news, and continued uncertainty in various aspects of this pandemic. And it's something that, while it's sometimes caricatured as being just about summer holidays, it's something that affects everything from the economy, trade, of course, as a newly independent trading country, in numerous different ways, right the way through to families who have been divided by necessity, by the rules in place over the course of the last year. And I think a lot of that's underscored by the hundreds and hundreds of people who've expressed a very keen interest in this event, the pages and pages of questions that have been submitted to me by viewers in advance. If you would like to submit a question during this live event, we will be putting your questions to the panel in the second half. Click the Q&A button, type them in. I will do my best to get through as many questions and aspects of this issue as we can. But without further ado, I'd like to move over to the people who you're actually tuning in to hear from, which is our panel. And first among them is Sean Doyle, the Chairman and Chief Executive of British Airways. He originally joined British Airways back in 1998. His careers include also serving as Chief Executive of Aer Lingus, and he has held the role of Chief Executive at British Airways since October 2020. So please welcome Sean.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to come along and participate in what I no doubt assume will be a very productive debate. I'm also delighted to be with my fellow panelists here tonight. I think we've got lots of very valuable input that I think people will enjoy in the next hour. But look, I wanted to kind of start by saying we do welcome the publication of the Global Travel Taskforce, because it does recognise that we need to find a way of restarting international travel. And we would hope that we can take a step forward on May the 17th in terms of getting aviation and getting travel back on its feet again. It's important to us as British Airways, it's important to airlines, but I think it's also very important for the prospects of economic recovery. And I think we should be ambitious, because we've got three things which are different this year compared to where we were last year. We're testing 1.6 million people a day. So the testing capability is significantly enhanced. We now have vaccinated 60% of adults across the UK. And thirdly, of course, we have got digital capability where we can capture verification data that can be used to enable travel and enable the safe restoration of travel. And I think it's worth kind of recalling that this is what aviation does. We manage risk. We manage risk every day. It's in our DNA. And we're very keen to make sure that we restart safely. And we think that we can adapt this framework to be more pragmatic, more affordable, but also to be more impactful in getting aviation back on its feet. We have members of the panel here tonight who will be better at explaining the health risks, so I won't dwell on that. We understand why we need a layered approach. So I think the categorization in the GTT report is good, but being blunt, it's complicated and it's expensive. And we would urge the government to look at ways of simplifying it. And I think we'd like to understand the data behind the framework, because in many aspects we feel that it is over-engineered. If I look at green countries, you've got at the minute a lateral flow test pre-departure, and then you have a PCR test post-arrival. Now, green by its nature will be low risk of variance, low risk of prevalence. If it's a low risk activity, the standard that is set for other activities in the economy, like schools, care homes, and other sort of activities we want to reinstate, we should be looking at rapid testing. We know it's effective, and we know it's a very effective layer of defense. And I think if somebody's traveling in a green corridor and they test positive for a lateral flow test, you then refer for a PCR test. And I think that would simplify the framework and make it a lot more affordable for travelers who are inherently low risk. I think the second thing is, the government has done an amazing job in vaccination, but there is no recognition of vaccinated travelers being lower risk in any of the corridors. It's a great opportunity. And we see, authorities like the CDC in the US recognizing that vaccinated people are lower risk and actually encouraging people who are vaccinated to be able to get out and do business again. So I think that's a huge opportunity across all of the corridors, is to acknowledge that vaccinated travelers will indeed be lower risk. If we look at amber countries, you're faced with up to 4 tests in amber. Amber today is what red was 6 months ago. So again, we'd like to understand the data as to why we need 3 PCR tests potentially after somebody crosses the border and comes in from an amber country. Work we've done with Oxira demonstrates that if you had a pre-departure test at minus 72 hours, followed by a post-arrival PCR test of plus 72, you will pick up 90% of infectious days. So there must be a simpler, more affordable way of managing the risk that we see in amber. And again, we would encourage that to be driven by data and to work with some of our experts to explore that opportunity. And look, why is this important? Well, I spoke about the damage to British Airways. It's been brutal for aviation. We now have 11,000 less people working in BA than we did this time last year. We used to fly to 25 plus cities in the US. The UK had the biggest direct network of any country in terms of aviation. And it was a very competed network. But all of that at the minute is at risk. And I worry that we're going to be left behind. I think other countries will move quicker on restoring their aviation networks. And that all adds up. We think there's a 55.7 billion loss of trade if we don't get our aviation networks reinstated. The US alone, every day we're closed, is costing us £32 million a day. And I would emphasize, I think the US is a huge opportunity. Vaccination is tracking more or less neck and neck with Britain. We would expect the pandemic to kind of take a similar course over the coming weeks. And the ability to open up a travel corridor between the UK and the US is an opportunity we should seize with energy. And I would encourage the government to really reach out and engage on enabling that. This is tougher for airlines than anything we've ever seen before. We had 9/11, we had the global financial crisis. You can add both of those up, and it is dwarfed by the scale of crisis that we're dealing with. And we're doing everything we can to come out of it. Our shareholders have put their hands in their pockets and recapitalized IAG. We've borrowed 2 billion from the UK government. We've raised 1.2 billion through a bond. We're very grateful for the furlough support we get, but furlough only really offsets about 25% of our wage bill, let alone all of the other costs that we need to fund to keep the airline ready to recover. And I think I would worry about the competitiveness of the UK sector when we look at the support and the ambition that we see in other jurisdictions to restart aviation. So the longer we stay in this holding pattern, I think the less competitive our sector will be. And the more we have to borrow, the more we have to repay. And it's already, I think, a scary level of gearing that us and other airlines have had to undertake. And I don't think our story is dissimilar to the wider challenge facing government. If you look at the ONS figures, government borrowing is at an all-time high. The good work that's been undertaken to reduce the deficit over the last 10 years is being undone. The deficit is now 271 billion. That's over 200 billion higher than it was this time last year. And we reckon borrowing will hit 394 billion by next March. So we're part of economic recovery. I think getting airlines back up and trading again is critical. And as you say, it's not just about holidays. I think, there is a huge aspect of global Britain here that we've got to understand. Where I come from in Ireland, there's an expression: if you want to buy the farm, you got to walk the land. If you want people to come into Britain and invest and to look at FDI and look at projects and to place talent and people here and to set up headquarters, we need to enable access. The US is our second biggest trading partner. The UK is the US's fifth biggest trading partner. There's a massive economic opportunity if we can pursue an air corridor, but a consequence if we don't. And I think, look, we want a pragmatic framework. We want the restoration of safe travel. We think the framework is a step in the right direction, but it needs to be more affordable. I think it needs to be more easily understood. And we can get back to doing business. We can get back to reuniting people with loved ones they haven't seen for a year, and also give people something like a holiday to look forward to in a way that's safe. So, we've an opportunity. We need to seize it. And we can't wait much longer.
Well, thank you very much, Sean Doyle, for that excellent scene setter and another illustration, really, of the severity of the experience from the airline and aviation sector's point of view over the last year. Now, I mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, in my introduction that we had experts on our panel who could illuminate different aspects of policy and of the response to this crisis. Our next speaker is David Evans, who is the joint CEO of Collinson, the UK's leading provider of COVID-19 travel testing. Collinson has a 55-year history of involvement in the international travel sector in many different respects, but including in emergency medical response to the Ebola outbreaks, to Zika, and now to the coronavirus pandemic. They currently deliver travel testing in terminal at Heathrow, Manchester, Stansted, a range of airports, as well as walk-in and drive-through centres. So he has a very specific and specialist perspective to bring to our panel. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming David Evans.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you, Sean, for a great introduction in terms of, I think, the numbers and the scale of impact that this pandemic's had on the travel industry. So as you said, Mark, Collinson's been involved in the travel sector throughout our history with 35 years of experience, and blending from some of the work that we do on airport lounges to our medical assistance work. And we got involved in airport testing to bring actually those two skill sets together, that travel medical experience that goes back 55 years and that real understanding of traveller demand. And we did so purely in an effort to try and restart travel. And that went back to probably last summer when we opened up the site at Heathrow, and the Secretary of State will remember, I think, a number of the papers talking about using that Heathrow Centre to try and capture information and capture early on trials to find out whether testing could work effectively on a single, at that point in time, single test on arrival, to then a two-taste test. And obviously today we've got that example where there are three different tests that are working from an amber. I think what we have seen throughout this pandemic is a real continual change and evolution of border controls, and sitting from a teams that are really very, very much on the forefront, that has added constantly to the confusion to the passengers. And one thing that we really want to see at the moment is simplified, easy to understand testing procedures. We know without a doubt that testing combined with probably some sort of digital or passport to understand vaccination rates, to understand protections that people have got in place. If we can simplify this to get that confusion down, you'll drive a much greater traveller confidence, which will enable people to travel across the world, just bring back that travel recovery that we haven't seen before. What Collinson is really keen to do is to work across governments to try and put in frameworks that aren't just about the UK, but they are bilateral, to make sure that the rules of engagement that sit, whether it's in the US or whether it's in the UK, are simplified. So we've been working with airlines and hotels and airports across the world to ensure that we're looking and building in these testing frameworks to open up those bubbles. If we don't do this, we're going to see a continual loss of revenue, I think, over this summer period. It is important, and Sean's absolutely right in saying that business travel and bringing trade back is one of those key things. But we also know that the survival of airlines, the survival of those in the travel trade, will need to see a return to revenue. Otherwise, we'll start to see Chapter 11s, we'll start to see more issues coming through with smaller businesses going under. And then that ability to rebuild post-pandemic is going to be an awful lot harder. So, from our point of view, it is really about, let's open up travel. Let's do so safely, but let's try and get as much consistency of approach and a simplified approach to moving further forward. And if we can get that simplified approach, I think we'll see greater adherence to the rules and an improved safe borders in the UK.
Well, thank you very much, David. Again, I think our second panelist there helping to flesh out some of the complexity and the priorities we're facing in this issue. We're going to see that continued when we're joined by our third panelist, Keith Glatz, Vice President of Airlines for America. Keith, I'm sure will be able to give his own personal expert perspective on this, but for illustration, as well as prior to his current role, he also has extensive experience negotiating on behalf of the US Department for Transportation in terms of access and reach and international agreements for US airlines and US carriers. And of course, one thing we heard earlier from Sean was about the prospect of, for example, a US-UK travel corridor, and we're here to discuss international travel. So joining us, please welcome Keith.
Oh, well, thank you, Mark. That was very kind, and thank you all for inviting me to join the panel today. It's an important conversation. But before I jump headlong into those comments, let me first take one moment to thank Secretary of State Shapps, his team, and their counterparts in the USG, not only for their recent work, but really the extraordinary work over the last year. It's been harrowing. I know they've been working day and night. We get messages all the time from his team and similarly those in the DOT. So thank you all for that work. It's with a bit of envy that I'll pick right up where Sean started, that we thank you for the most recent GTTF report. And while we share the same concerns that Sean outlined with the report, it is in fact a starting point, and congratulations for that. And the envy is that we are still looking for that roadmap and framework from the US administration, and that's something we can touch on a bit later in my comments. But quickly, if I can just paint a bit of a picture of what's happened to the US airline industry before the pandemic and where we are now coming out of the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, we were at A4A and in the US airlines, basically referring to the last 10 years as kind of the golden age of travel. We were carrying 2.5 million passengers a day, over 58,000 tons of cargo. U.S. Airlines as a group employed nearly 800,000 workers, helped supported more than 10 million jobs in the U.S. economy, and drove well over 5% of GDP. And then almost overnight, we fell off a cliff due to COVID. It was about just a little over a year ago. At the lowest point, our traffic fell well over 96%. We erased the 10 consecutive years of modest profitability swiftly and entirely. I think last year we had roughly $46 billion in pre-tax losses. We're projected to have another 16 to 17 billion in losses again this year. We lost 93,000 full-time employees, 20%. The good news is some of those employees have been added back thanks to the Payroll Support Act here in the US. We've had 31,000 hires back since December. And what we're seeing on a bit of a positive front is that domestically, as the vaccination distribution rolls out, the booking and the demand is increasing daily. And domestically, we see great numbers. The difficulty continues to be both the business traffic and the international traffic, where we still see really suppressed demand, well over 80% at times. And a lot of this is driven, of course, by the travel restrictions that are still in place and the patchwork of global regulations that are now going to be with us for some time post-pandemic. But despite this, the US airline industry and the global industry really has spent the better part of the last year 100% focused on ensuring the safety of our passenger employees, right? So since day one of the pandemic, we as an industry decided to follow the science, to take a multi-layered risk mitigation approach on our flights. In the US and in the UK and a lot around the world, you've seen airlines be the first out of the gate, more, I think, before any other industry, for example, requiring customers to board our flights wearing face masks. We went to a point at one time where we were actually blocking seats on the aircraft before we were certain of what the social distancing standards would need to be. We went to the effort of installing HEPA air filtration systems on our aircraft, similar to those that you would see found in hospital quarantine settings. And these were all of those measures stemmed initially from the various relationships that we had with leading medical and science groups around the US. And what we found was that we thought it would be helpful for those on the outside of the industry to hear from some independent sources. So then Harvard did an independent study of the efficacies of these measures, as did US Transcom. And frankly, what they found is that in terms of transmission, you're far safer to be on an airplane, on a flight, than you are to be in a local pub, a local restaurant or a grocery store. And I think we can come back to this in a minute, but it kind of highlights to a degree how far behind we are in moving forward with removing these restrictions on international aviation when you compare them to what's happening in the rest of our economy. In addition to the measures that we took initially to self-help, we've also worked closely with the US government, the UK government. We are now voluntarily collecting on the US side the contacting tracing data of all international passengers arriving into the US. Similarly, we've worked with the UK on the PLF form, and we've been supportive of pre-departure testing for inbound passengers, international inbound passengers in the US, and that's been in effect by executive order since January 26th. So putting a bow on all that, I say that to basically come back to our point of the panel today, how do we reopen? And I think it's without a doubt, all of the work that we've done, that you've heard from me and from Sean and from David, has really laid a framework, the groundwork necessary for us to reopen travel in a safe way internationally. Just a couple of weeks ago, as was mentioned earlier, the CDC has now said, in fact, for US vaccinated travelers, it is safe to travel. I think that's an important step forward. But we need governments globally to agree and be transparent about what the public health metrics and triggers are going to be to lift international travel restrictions, what we have in place in the US called 212F. We need to repeal those restrictions. They no longer make sense at this point in the pandemic. And this is true across governments. It's not just the US and the UK, but we see these restrictions in place that made sense at the beginning of the pandemic, but the science no longer supports them at this point in the pandemic. And so really you've got a situation where politics is starting to muddle a bit in policy, the following of science. And we need to really unwind those and follow the science in the name of protecting our citizens, passengers, employees. In terms of the US-UK travel corridor, look, we've been trying to stand this up for the better part of a year. As most of you are on the panel well know, we've pushed very hard and very publicly for a travel corridor, and we think the time is right to do that as soon as possible. So we're hopeful the two governments, in this case, the US and UK, will have a roadmap in place for a commercially meaningful opening, a wide and deep opening in time for the summer season. That is most definitely our hope, and that's what we're going to keep working towards. And in close, before I turn it back to you, Mark, I guess I would say, although this is a panel and the intention is to have a good discussion, perhaps the time for talking about reopening is really growing short, and now it's time for action. Right? We stand ready to continue to work with the US and the UK to reopen these markets, but the idea of losing another summer season doesn't make sense given all the progress the two countries and the two countries' airlines have made to reopen the market. And with that, thanks.
Thank you very much, Keith Glatz. On that topic of the data and the science, our next speaker is George Batchelor, the director and co-founder of Edge Health. He's an economist and data scientist, and Edge Health provides tailored healthcare data analytics, including in his work over the course of the pandemic has included some of the earliest analysis of the potential impact of COVID-19 on the NHS and on informing government policy on things like test to release. So please welcome George.
Thank you, and it's really delightful to be on this panel with so many sort of esteemed fellow panelists. I am George Batchelor, director and co-founder of Edge Health, and what I'm really going to focus on in my opening remarks is the work that we've done with the aviation sector over the past few months, and just to pull out some of the key points from that. And I think that the main one is that it's been over a year since the emergence of COVID, and it really has turned from societal threat into a risk that can be managed and mitigated. And that's largely possible due to not just a better understanding that we have of the disease and the virus, but also from the huge advances in testing and the very successful vaccination campaigns, both here and in the US. Just on testing, PCR testing is often referred to as the gold standard of testing. But what we've seen and what the evidence suggests is that antigen testing technology has moved on a lot over the past year, and they're very effective, and in some cases as effective as PCR, at picking out those infectious days that Sean kind of mentioned earlier. In fact, the best performing antigen tests will only miss about 1 in 1,000 passengers that are potentially infectious. And I won't go into the reasons why antigen testing might be operationally more desirable, but purely from the perspective of mitigating risk, a rapid test done before departure has many attractions. And in terms of the effectiveness, it's as effective as a blanket 10-day quarantine, where we know that the compliance with that quarantine varies across people. In terms of like where you need to manage a greater risk, there are advantages to multiple testing and dual testing. But what's important to recognize is that the gains from multiple testing are diminishing, and the cost increases with each test. And that's not just the cost paid, but the operational cost of how that's all managed. So the key point on testing is that we understand it a lot better. The technology has moved on a lot over the last year. You know, when it was effectively considered that testing might be misleading and give a false sense of security. On vaccinations, I think it's fair to say, and you know, and huge well done to the sort of the people who've led this program. But the UK has really excelled in the vaccination program, both in developing, procuring, distributing vaccines. And it's important to recognise how lucky we are with the vaccines, which are all highly effective when you compare them to the type of vaccines that we've had historically for flu. And this is including in the real world data. So you do start to wonder why all the caution. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, this is a global pandemic and there are no easy answers or to way to eliminate it. But vaccines do really help. There just might be a possibility that parts of the virus spread and get around that. So like testing, vaccines are a tool to mitigate and reduce risk. But in terms of what that means for international travel and sort of getting back to business as it's called, there's currently no clear statement on what level of risk is acceptable for international travel. But based on the travel corridors that we had last summer, we know that the average prevalence in an origin country for a travel corridor is about 33 cases per 10,000 people. And last summer, that allowed 62 of 143 countries to be open for a period. Now that we've got the vaccinations where they're at, and by the summer, that 62 could safely be increased to about 100. And if we add in departure testing, single antigen on departure testing, that could be closer to 134 or possibly more. So what we now see is that there are some real benefits from the testing and vaccination programs that can start to reopen travel. That does, of course, sort of, you know, flag the concern that I know is very much topical at the moment, but variants, which are less straightforward. But it's important to put variants into context. The last year of pandemic has produced about 4,000 different variants, of which currently only 4 of those are of a concern in the UK. I think there's a couple more in the US. But those variants, 2 of those 4 are identified as from the Kent region in the UK and is now dominant in the UK. So there's really only 2 variants that kind of add on to the risk there. And they share some of the same concerning mutations. And I think what we're seeing, at least in the data, is that there's a degree of convergent evolution around the variants, with them coalescing around the same mutations. And, you know, it's fair to say that new variants like COVID almost certainly arrived from international travel. But as we've seen in Australia, even with very strict border controls, there's a degree of inevitability that this will happen. And in that context, domestic policies alongside very targeted travel policies will remain critical for controlling the spread of COVID as we look forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And I think that completes the small number of limited issues which now land on the desk of our final panelist. Grant Shapps will be very familiar to many of our viewers and to ConservativeHome readers generally, as well as currently being currently being Secretary of State for Transport. He's a former chairman of the Conservative Party and often done us the honour of joining panels for Conservative Home events, real and virtual. And thank you very much, Grant, for joining us now.
Mark, thanks very much, and thanks for welcoming me onto the panel. Look, when I became Transport Secretary in 2019, I don't think I ever thought that I would be on a panel with you discussing how we restart the aviation sector. Pre-pandemic, this was a sector that was growing particularly strongly. I was looking up the figures between 1992 and 2019. The UK air travel sector trebled from 100 to 300 million. And the UK had the largest aviation network in Europe, and in fact, the third largest in the world after only the USA and China. So this past year has obviously, as we've been hearing, seen the sector grind to a halt. And a lot of people, including in your chats here, I've been answering a few whilst others have been speaking, have been asking, where's our support been? Well, the answer is it's been £7 billion in strength, because that's how much and counting we put into supporting the aviation sector through things like furlough and many other schemes as well. When it comes to fighting the virus, I think the good news is, Mark, that the tide is genuinely turning. I think thanks to the brilliant, true British organisation, which has seen 43 million vaccines across the UK given out and translated to more than 3 in 5 adults having received their first dose, with the second now catching up pretty quickly. There really is light at the end of the tunnel. And that brings an opportunity, including the things we love, like international travel, but also a risk of losing those hard-won gains, particularly if we have any kind of emergence of variants which are a problem. The ones that are concerned actually do turn out to be problematic. Then that could push the whole thing off keel. And that's why the Global Travel Taskforce that others have mentioned was launched. I launched on the 9th of April. And it provided what I hope is a reasonably clear roadmap to reopening international travel. Now, I've heard Sean and others quite rightly say, that's all very well, you've got these traffic lights, but until we know exactly who is in which traffic light, it isn't clear at all. And I understand that entirely. But I can't put the cart before the horse. I need to see which countries closer to the earliest possible opening up date of international travel, which is May the 17th, are in what position. If we've learned anything over the past year, it's that countries in the situation where COVID does move around very quickly indeed. If we went back 3 months, it was the United Kingdom who had amongst the highest levels in the world, whereas now we're talking about some of the lowest. But whatever we do, we've got to make sure that we don't end up bringing dangerous variants back into our country. And that's why the traffic light system will categorize countries based on risk. And that will be set up. And I'll be saying more about that at the beginning of May. Now, look, testing is going to be a very important part of the roadmap, and the overall approach will be reviewed. So this is not something which will be set in stone and forever. Indeed, I don't want this to be around forever. I don't want to have a traffic light system forever. But I've actually set out 3 specific review dates, which are the end of June, end of July, and October. And I want to see a healthy market in testing. I want to see the prices driven down. I was very interested in what George and others were saying about the way that tests operate. And we've all become semi-experts and some real experts on the panel about specificity and sensitivity and providing different standards for tests. And my goodness, David and I have been debating this issue out for many months, as he mentioned. But look, for the time being, the truth is that a PCR test gets us to somewhere closer to the truth about somebody's coronavirus. And for the time being, that's the one that's going to be required. But I'm very pleased to say that in addition to excellent providers like Collinson's, others are in the market. And I want to see a properly competitive market driving down the cost of these tests. Some of the higher test costs that we've seen on the government website or linked to private testers from there turn out to be for full service where people will come to your home and carry out the test. I'm going to separate those out. We're going to drive down the cost of tests. I'm pleased to say there's a provider, for example, on there who have, subsequent to my saying this, cut their prices to £60 tests with 120,000 available a day. Indeed, there's another provider who are going through accreditation and going to be offering PCR tests for £45. So we're exploring all different ways to drive that cost down. And again, in answer to those who say, why don't we have lateral flow? I'm looking at being able to provide lateral flow tests to people. In fact, people actually taking the lateral flow test potentially that they already have access to twice a week from home, a sort of COVID version of bring your own bottle when you go on holiday and take your test and carry it out before you leave and get onto the flight. Now, I know there's tremendous frustration in the aviation sectors and the tourism sectors about the restrictions that we continue to have to impose, and I've been reading them in the comments. I feel it from the speakers, and I share those frustrations 100%. What Transport Secretary, what freedom-loving Conservative Transport Secretary wants to restrict free movement? The answer is I don't, but only by creating a very robust regime, a safe regime for international travel can we keep the nation healthy. And people will not thank us if it is through aviation and travel that we somehow ended up going backwards through all of the sacrifices that people went through, including staying at home for the best part of a year and coming forward when asked to do so for a vaccination. So we have to be absolutely certain we've nailed it this time. And that way, I think we can begin and will be beginning to nurse the airline, airport, international travel sectors back to health. And holidays are very important. They're important for people's mental health and much else, but even more important are family reunifications. And I know that family and friends' reasons for travel were amongst the fastest growing before the pandemic. And we can see why, given the international nature of our country, where so many people or parents of youngsters here were born abroad, we've got this huge global network. I want to help relationships get reconnected and rekindled and help our aviation sector take off again. Because at last, I think, we can think of a post-pandemic world, which is something I've been looking forward to saying for many, many months. And that's a world in which we have a brand new political reality with additional economic freedoms bestowed upon us actually by Brexit. And I'll give you a very small example of this, one of thousands in my red box behind me here, are things like our ability to make our own decisions over airport allocations, the slots for landing and taking off, which has all been controlled Europe-wide for many, many years, has now come back to me. But there are literally thousands of other choices about the way that we do things at home. And in short, we, I think, have, Mark, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use these new freedoms and redesign how we do things in this country. And we can begin our new future post-Brexit, post-pandemic. I'm placing the thriving aviation sector right at the heart of what we need to do to make a success of global Britain. So we've got the vaccine rollout, which has shown the country is capable of doing these things really well. I now want to see us take that successful approach and apply it to other parts of the economy and transport and beyond. Embrace innovation, be nimble, take risks. We've seen the good this can do. I'm going to stick my neck out here on this ConservativeHome event and say, if we use these new freedoms wisely, if we display a can-do attitude, if we think and act like more of an upstart nation, an Israel, a Singapore, a South Korea, then I think that Britain, or the United Kingdom, can become the largest economy in Europe by 2050. So you heard it here first. I think that in the short term, we need to cautiously and wisely open up travel. But in the long term, we've got every reason to believe in ourselves and believe in the United Kingdom. And I think we can make this happen. And I think it's about to start, I hope, the 17th of May at the earliest.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I'll make a note in my diary to drop you a line in 2050, come the ONS data for comparison. We've got lots and lots of questions coming in. If you're one of the many people watching at home, do feel free to keep pressing that Q&A button, putting your questions through. I know, as the Secretary of State just mentioned, he's actually answered some of you directly himself, which is something you don't often get the opportunity to do with a cabinet minister. Can we just come to our first question from a viewer, Thomas Harding? I think this is particularly for the Secretary of State. He says, the UAE has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. As you're aware, there's some consternation that it remains on the red list. Given the news about India being added to the red list, what does a country have to do to get travel restrictions lifted once it's been placed on the red list? And do vaccinations count in the algorithm for lifting UK travel restrictions?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are four things. The Joint Biosecurity Centre are the people who look at this. And what they are doing is looking at, one, what is the level of infection in that country? Two, what is the level of vaccination in that country? Three, how good is the genome sequencing in that country? By the way, folks, we do half of the entire world's genome sequencing for all of the coronavirus. We do half of it in this country. And four, how good is their data? How believable is it? And I look at a case like the UAE. We're not restricting the UAE because of levels of coronavirus in the UAE. The specific issue with the UAE is one of transit. It's because they're a major transit hub. And the Joint Biosecurity Centre can work wonders studying all this detail, but eventually you get to the point where they're having to make too many assumptions about where people are traveling to from, and that is the specific issue that we have with the UAE, as opposed to prevalence or some other reason. I hope that actually explains some of the context for some of the wider decisions as well, because they're very interested in things like variants of concern, and people have said, why did you wait so long on India? Well, the answer is we don't have yet a variant of concern in India. What we've got is a variant of interest, which is being studied, for which you have to grow cultures and do many other things that the scientists on the panel can tell you about. But those are the kind of factors that the Joint Biosecurity Centre will look at, making their recommendations to us.
Thank you. And this is a question that comes across, that's been raised by several people in advance, and several of our questioners on the live panel this evening. I particularly want to raise with George and then with Sean. A lot of different people are raising examples of the idea of individual exemptions or expanding the conditions for travel. So, for example, would family reunification or visiting family potentially be added to the list for essential travel? Could there be alternative rules for somebody who's leaving the UK but does not intend to return, somebody who's emigrating? Could there be variations in the rules for people who might opt to isolate at home rather than in quarantine hotels? And I suppose for George, how much does adding, how much wriggle room is there in that question of risk management and also just studying the risk? How much wriggle room is there in that budget, as it were, to introduce variation to the rules? And secondly, Sean, how much of that is a problem for the idea of keep it simple, stupid, conflicting with the idea of wanting to broaden out the potential passenger base who are allowed to return to international travel? George, you first, please.
Yeah, I might rephrase the question slightly, if that's okay, just
Please
to
do.
say that I think the individual exemptions is less of the issue, and it's more around the risk that might come from expanding them. And what I think our work has shown, or the work that we've done has shown, is that you need as good an understanding of the risk as you can get from the country that someone may be traveling from, including if it's from the UK. And then you need to mitigate that appropriately, either through testing and or vaccination, taking into account, also picking up on the point that the Secretary of State made. I think that there is, I think it just has to be realistic about what's doable and what compliance levels you're going to get with whatever regime you put in place. And I think Keith and Sean both picked up on this, but there is something about having a regime that is as simple as possible so that you get as high a compliance with it as possible. And I think that the further you drift away from something that feels proportionate, the bigger the risk you have around compliance.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I think, look, that there's probably one very big opportunity in terms of exemptions, and that's to look at, vaccinated travellers. If you take a vaccinated traveller travelling to and from a green country, what are the probabilities that you've been vaccinated, you're travelling to a place with low prevalence and no variants of concern, and then, you take a pre-departure test. I'd love to know the statistical kind of risk of that traveller, why they have to take a kind of arrival test 2 days later to a PCR standard. I would say you've got chances of winning the lottery, which are higher than testing positive in that scenario. So I think you could take a very simple statistical approach, and I would encourage, I think, the framework to consider that. I think there's other countries have done things like shortening dwell times. I know European countries at 48 hours where people could travel in with a test, do some business and leave again. So they obviously had assessed that was a risk mitigation, but also enabled some kind of business travelers to get up and running. As of a couple of days ago, Ireland, which has probably had an even more restrictive policy in international travel than the UK, has basically allowed people who have been vaccinated fully to self-isolate at home rather than to do a hotel quarantine. So that's an example of a near neighbour adopting a more pragmatic approach. And again, it's because of the kind of visiting friends and relative pent-up demand that they see, and a lot of the kind of heartbreaking stories about the affordability of hotel quarantine. So they've obviously risk assessed that. So I think, within the framework, there are opportunities to kind of look at different segments and, not to overcomplicate it, because I do think that pre-departure testing, vaccination, there's opportunities within that to kind of mitigate risk and enable a freer flow of travel.
Thank you. David, can I bring you in on something that was mentioned by the Secretary of State that again has been raised by several different questioners from the audience on this question of what the practicality is, what the timescale is, what the financial effect is of actually being able to reduce things like costs of testing?
Absolutely. I think cost of testing comes down to a couple of things, and I think it's wonderful to see that competitive marketplace. I think everyone's always looking for it. But George will concur with this. There is also a difference between doing a self-administered test versus something that's getting done by a medical practitioner. And one might argue, looking at some of the stats and the numbers, that an antigen test done by a medical practitioner is more accurate than a PCR test that's self-administered. So I think there's a few things in there that, when we're always looking at it, specificity is not always lab induced, but you've got to look at some of that real world criteria, and you've got to make sure you've got that adherence. Key part, and it's been touched on before, of reducing the test is also going to be VAT, and that's not necessarily just VAT on the total test itself, but it's all on the component parts. It's on the lab costs, it's on the PPE costs, it's on the rent, it's anything that sits within that supply chain. And seeing if we can get a reduction on VAT that can be absolutely passed on direct to the consumer will be another thing that can reduce that cost. I think for me, the other part is again, keep looking at the stats, keep looking at the information. And we worked with Virgin, we worked with British Airways right at the early part of that pandemic to look at the effectiveness at a single test. We've now done over 250,000 tests that's come through, and with the tester release and the 2+8, we've started to get live data on a number of cases across a period of time to look at the effectiveness of the tests that we do on or before day 2, so effectively on arrival, and the results that are coming through at day 8. And we're seeing a trend that actually validates the information that we did right at the last summer, which is showing that actually a single test captures the vast majority of those people. And we're also starting to capture that data, as I'm sure the government and the DHSC are looking at as well, around the compliance of people doing those 2 tests as well. And it's difficult always to track, because you've got overseas visitors who may come in, do the first test, and then return home before day 8. But we are seeing a drop-off rate, despite the fact that people have paid for it, between those day 2 and day 8 tests. So again, if you're looking at an amber package, one way of reducing it is to look at a single test package. So there's a number of different things that can be done, including, obviously, as other countries have done, government subsidies for some of these things. We know the good news is, at the moment, is the government's pre-bought and has got a lot of PCR demand out there. Can the travel trades use some of that extra lab capacity in terms of getting it through? Because a big chunk of the cost is obviously going to be the lab costs. For us who do it in site, staff costs is another big component. It's very different as it is from buying your beer at Tesco's or buying it down the pub. There's always a different cost for doing so. But there's definitely a few things we could look at.
Thank you. Keith, Glatz, can I bring you in just on what the American experience has been on that front, please?
Sure, thanks. So, the availability of testing and those resources at the outset of this conversation were a question that all the U.S. airlines have. The availability of testing now in the U.S. is fairly widespread. The cost, I think, is still fairly significant. We've been told recently that in the UK, a PCR test can be over £100. I think in the US, it's certainly in a rapid situation, which you would need for a pre-departure, still well over $100. I have general concerns, I'm sure Sean and others here do too, about the notion of, a 3-test system. We've expressed these before, where the potential cost of 3 tests would outstrip or potentially be more than the actual cost of the ticket. That seems to really put a damper on demand. And one now I think rightfully should be asking, with so many people vaccinated and now getting their second dose of vaccination, what is the necessity of a 2 or 3 test system? Maybe you could understand a 1 test system at the outset of a reopening, but I think quickly that should be reviewed, because ultimately the reason why governments have done this in the UK and US and done such a good job and supported by airlines and the public is so that once we were fully vaccinated, we could return to school, work, travel, as we did without the necessity of being tested multiple times for, can you imagine the average business trip to London is 3 to 5 days at most? From a US perspective, 3 tests, it's almost untenable. So while in the short run, it may make some sense to get things up and running, I think we need to be looking quickly at that. And if you don't mind, if I could just hit on one other thing that Secretary Shapps had mentioned earlier about all the new tools in the toolbox for the UK. I certainly agree with that. And he noted specifically slots and taking back control of that. And that's a hugely important issue, especially when you have congested airports like Heathrow. I think it's important for those slots to be as freely available when they do come available as possible. Everyone recognizes the huge value of them, both for incumbents, but also for the new entrants who will also stimulate the economy and bring new services into the market. So I just wanted to add that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary of State, in response to those answers, but also just to bring in a listener at home, Suzanne L., who says, as a UK taxpayer, I can have all-you-can-eat COVID testing here. Why should I have to pay for them when I travel? Is there an option to only charge non-UK residents?
Yeah. So sorry, that question's in regard to the testing or the
testing.
In regard to testing. Yeah, and this is exactly why I'm saying, things like we're looking at things like whether people can take their tests away and therefore not incur additional costs to take that first test. I'm not sure I quite agree with the kind of look. We have to work our way out of this and maintain public confidence. And here we are, 6 of us. All very pro-aviation, livelihoods in at least 4 of the cases dependent, 3 of the cases maybe to some extent or other. The economy, very, very tied up in it. I absolutely agree with Sean's comments about the importance of it, and I tried to reflect that in my comments. But here's where, and your audience, so I'm getting through questions gradually there. I've answered a number, but heavily pro-aviation. Here is where the public are. They do not want us to screw this up now. They do not want to have gone through a year of lockdown for nothing. They do not want to risk. And if you ask the public, if you look at the polling, they basically say, just close the damn borders. Why are you being so slow? That's the question. It's not the questions that are coming in. That's the question. Now, I don't think it's an either or. We should be able to do both. We need to do both. We're a great global country. We're an island, obviously. As I mentioned in my remarks, we've got more families probably abroad than any other major economy. We need to have that flexibility to travel, but we have to do it in such a way that we maintain the confidence of the public and that we are clear ourselves. One very interesting question in the questions here. I'm sorry I didn't get to answer it yet, but somebody was saying, these variants of concern, you guys, what are you worrying about? That's basically what the question says in there. The answer is you could have said the same thing about the Kent variant, B117, B117, right? And look what the Kent variant did. It killed more people than the original variant just at a time last September, October, when people were saying, it's all over now, guys, why aren't you unlocking? So let's not, we've got to do this sensibly. And I say this with the interests of the aviation sector in my heart, as much as for the rest of the country. We've got to do it safely and we've got to do it once and for all. And if that errs on, look, you need a couple of tests, one of which is a lateral flow test and it's free, then people are used to taking tests now. That's not a great barrier. And we've talked about driving down the costs of these PCR tests, of which the least expensive one I think is £58 on the linked at the moment, and other providers are coming in. That's good news. But I do think we need to do this very carefully. And sorry, Mark, just to abuse the fact that I've got the mic for a second. A lot of people in the chat function have been asking about the US. Why don't you get this corridor open? Keith's absolutely right about it. I'm speaking to my new opposite number, Pete Buttigieg, all the time, regularly now about this. The simple answer is that President Trump passed an executive order 212F that Keith mentioned before, which bans Brits from traveling to the States and bans Europeans and many other countries from traveling there. And that has been in place since I think March the 12th, if I remember rightly, last year, not this year. And that is the thing which needs to lift in order to be able to open up these different corridors. And so to answer a question that's sort of been asked, of course, we're having bilateral conversations with a number of different countries at the same time, which sort of answers Sean's vaccine point. What's the point of vaccinating if you're not going to go to other places which are highly vaccinated, etc. Yes, of course, we recognise that, although we're waiting for much of the rest of the world to catch up with our level of vaccination. But of course, we want to do that, and we are having those conversations, and that sort of sits alongside the traffic light system. I hope that's kind of helpful.
Thank you. And what I saw in one of the other questions you've touched on in some of your text responses to the audience, which will bring in a few different panelists on at this point. What is the government's position right now on vaccine passports? How would they work? When would they come in? And what impact they have in terms of international travel policy and the reopening thereof?
And that's to me, or to...
Yes, please, just to start with.
Okay, so look, what we did with the traffic light system is described a system which is where we'll categorize countries. And as I mentioned before, that will include in the categorization by the Joint Biosecurity Centre an assessment of where they're up to on things like vaccinations. So it's not the case that, you know, we end up very vaccinated by the summer, and so does X country, and we're still saying you can't travel. No, they would automatically find themselves in a better category, a better traffic light category as a result. So there's that aspect, and then separate to that, we are also aware that there'll be a large number of countries who say you can come here if you're vaccinated, or you can come here if you can show us recent testing. And so the vaccine passports, or perhaps more descriptively, vaccine certification, will of course be part of international travel. And I don't think it's controversial in the same way as it is as having a vaccine passport for a pub, which is, I know, very controversial. I don't think anyone will bat an eyelid at the idea that you need to show that. And of course, NHSX are working on exactly that, and we'll be saying more about that when we are ready to reopen international travel, which we hope will be by May the 17th at the earliest.
And Sean, what's your position on that? What's your thought about it? What are you hearing from potential passengers on it?
Yeah, I think we have technology available to verify whether it's a negative test or a vaccine. We're working with 3 different providers, so I think in terms of having apps or things in our booking flows that can kind of verify these requirements, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. What we really need, I think, is a sort of consistent framework where you can actually, automate, I think, the verification of whether it's a test or a vaccine, with a government sort of regulator like NHSX, and do the same when you're looking at the US, so that we can scale these verification solutions consistently across borders. And I agree with the Secretary of State. I think, if vaccination credentials are part of the ability to restore international travel, people will say, bring it on. And we're ready to verify it, but I think we can create a very automated and simple infrastructure to do this. It's not a very hard thing to verify compared to what other data we transmit and have to manage for travel. Have you had a vaccine? Yes or no? Can we verify it? Yes, we can. Should you be green to travel if you've had? That is well within our sights, and we can do it quickly. But I agree, it does require integration with people like NHSX, with Border Force, and with other jurisdictions across the global travel community.
And can I also just ask you there if you have a response to the Secretary of State's point just before about the fact that it is easy for us here in a discussion looking particularly at the industry, for example, to talk about the benefits of reopening. But there's also, he's right, isn't he? There's quite a lot of resistance among a lot of members of the public about the risks of going too fast, for example.
Yeah, look, I think good policy has to look forward as well as kind of think about where we are today. And we understand completely the trauma that people have been through. But I think if in 2 months' time you ask people, should I be able to travel freely to and from a country if I've been vaccinated and vaccination is at a very high rate in that country, I think you'll get a very different answer then. And I think policy has got to look forward because we have to plan over a time horizon, which isn't just next week. You know, if I want to rebuild our networks over the summer and get people back working in British Airways, we need to be able to look ahead 3-4 months down the line. And I think public mood and public appetite will change and change pretty quickly.
Thank you. And I'm very conscious we're now running up against the end of our time, but there is one other thing I wanted to bring in, which has come up from quite a few questioners. For the Secretary of State, I'd also be very interested to hear Keith's thoughts on it, please, which is last summer we saw some more granular than national policy on reopening. So you saw some island exemptions, for example, particular Greek islands, allowing for some kind of economic activity to resume for aviation, international travel. Is that on the cards again this year, Secretary of State?
Actually, funny enough, I just answered somebody in the chat just a second on that point. Yes, that was a sort of innovation partway through when we had the resources available to analyze often much smaller markets. The answer to the simple answer is yes. I want to do that again. I don't want to go backwards. I want to go forwards with this. That's why I've also introduced this idea of a green watch list to sort of avoid the problems of last year, where you turn up, as I did, turn up in Spain, and then myself put Spain into the category of not being in a travel corridor, and turned myself round and came home so I could start my quarantine period. And I appreciate from first-hand experience, amongst others, why that is very problematic. And the longer this crisis has gone on, the more we've learned about the virus, the more I think it's our responsibility to respond to it and try and put sensible things in place. Having a green watch list is one potential way of doing that. Carrying on with the islands approach is another. One of the things it really challenges us, and it's kind of sitting here in the UK, easy to forget that many countries do not have an Office of National Statistics of the quality and independence that we do. They don't have scientists of the outstanding type everywhere globally that we do, particularly when you start to go to some of the smaller locations. You're just not going to have that kind of critical mass of data and reliability and genome sequencing and the rest of it. And it means that we're having to try to sort of second guess what's going on in the market. And sometimes last year, frankly, we found out that we weren't always being given entirely truthful data. And so the reliability of that data is also very, very important. But the simple answer to the question is yes, I absolutely want to carry on with that as an innovation on the islands.
So encouraging. Keith, is that something you're also hearing from, say, the US government?
Yeah, I think it might be good just to clarify quickly. So yes, it is true. We have 212F that's been in existence for over a year. And while it does restrict the movement from the UK and from the EU Schengen area, Brazil, and China primarily, the rest of the world to the US today is open. And that is why I don't think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when 212F will be repealed. I've heard from various sources all across the US government that in fact, there's broad recognition that it does in fact need to be repealed, and they're going to go through the bureaucratic measures necessary to do so. But to Sean's point, we really need that to happen as soon as possible, because in order for us to take planes out of the desert that have been parked and bring staff back on and make operations viable for this coming summer season and going into next fall, we have to understand what those triggers and measures will be for this reopening, kind of like yesterday. Otherwise, even when the governments do say everybody's free to travel, we're going to be behind the 8 ball in order to stand those operations back up. So look, on the whole, I'm optimistic that we're going to get there and get there soon. Sean is right. The public is definitely going to be answering the question definitely a month, a week, 2 months from now about, are you ready to open up and move? I see it anecdotally where I am right now. So it's coming, and we just need to work in real time with governments to make sure we have the roadmap to make it happen when it does. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, I mentioned at the start we were going to wrap up at 8. I've used the tyrannical power of the chair of the event to be greedy with our panelists' time, and we've thank you to all of you for enabling us to answer literally dozens of questions. Thank you to the Secretary of State for going directly to some of our audience as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been very, very fortunate to be joined by Sean Doyle, by David Evans, by Keith Glatz, by George Batchelor, and by Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State, this evening. We've also been fortunate to be joined by all of you at home, and I'm sure that this is not the end of this discussion. It's the start of a further debate and discussion of this crucial economic and policy area. I hope next time we come to discuss it and to look at the future of international travel, we might be able to do so in person, in the same room, and it's certainly something ConservativeHome will be returning to again soon. Thank you also to Airlines UK for their sponsorship of the event, for making this evening possible as a free event to such a large audience. And thank you for joining ConservativeHome once more. We'll see you next time. Good night.
Thank you.